Background. 100 years ago, the sorcerer Xenopus built a tower on the low hills overlooking Port Town. The tower was close to the sea cliff west of the town and, appropriately, next door to the graveyard. Rumor has it that the magician made extensive cellars and tunnels underneath the tower. The town is located on the ruins of a much older city of doubtful history, and Xenopus was said to excavate in his cellars in search of ancient treasures. 50 years ago, on a cold, wintry night, the wizard's tower was suddenly engulfed in green flame. Several of his human servants escaped the Holocaust, saying their master had been destroyed by some powerful force he had unleashed in the depths of the tower. Needless to say, the tower stood vacant for a while after this. But then the neighbors and the night watchman complained that ghostly blue lights appeared in the windows at night, that ghastly screams could be heard emanating from the tower at all hours, and goblin figures could be seen dancing on the tower roof in the moonlight. Finally, the authorities had a catapult rolled through the streets of town, and the tower was battered to rubble. This stopped the hauntings, but the townsfolk continued to shun the ruins. The entrance to the old dungeons can be easily located as a flight of broad stone steps leading down into darkness. But the few adventurous souls who have descended into crypts below have either reported only empty stone corridors or have failed to return at all. Other magic users have moved into the town, but the site of the old tower remains abandoned. Whispered tales are told of fabulous treasure and unspeakable monsters in the underground passages below the hilltop, and the storytellers are always careful to point out that the reputed dungeons lie in close proximity to the foundations of the older, pre-human city, to the graveyard, and to the sea. Port Town is a small but busy city linking the caravan routes from the south to the merchant ships that dare the pirate-infested waters of the northern sea. Humans and non-humans from all over the globe meet here. At the Green Dragon Inn, the players of the game gather their characters for an assault on the fabulous passages beneath the ruined wizard's tower.
And that is from the Dungeons & Dragons basic set by J. Eric Holmes. I am D&D historian, gadfly, and nerd about town, Ben Riggs. With me, as always, is the weapon of mass instruction himself, Dr. Scott Bruner. And finally, we have blessing us with his presence today, the man, the myth, the bearded legend that is Jonathan Tweet. To say anything about your CV, I feel would be to do you a disservice because it's so long and so rich. What would you highlight of the work that you have done, Mr. Tweet?
That's a great question. I feel like my career has been always doing something different, and so I've done one role-playing game after another. Ars Magica, Everway, Over the Edge, 3rd edition D&D, and now 13th Age, and every one of those is different from the one before. And that's why it is kind of hard to sum up, but that's been my career, is trying to figure out new ways to play role-playing games, new kinds of fun to get out of the experience.
That's a great way to put it. I'm just going to jump off with an obnoxious question first thing. If you were going to run a game that you designed, what game would you choose to run of the games that you designed?
I don't know. I might do a whole new one. Like, for me, the real interesting thing is creating new rules. And I've got this idea of doing maybe a D&D like system where combat goes even faster than in 13th Age. And because on the second round, all damage is doubled. And on the third round, all damage is, I don't know, quadrupled, I think. And then everything just ratchets it up so fast that the combat's bound to be over at the end of 3 rounds, maybe 4. So that, like, it's hard to do something I've already done. I'm always trying to do something new. Otherwise, it would really be based on my audience. For people who aren't big role players, I might do Everway. For my friends, my smart wicked dark humor friends, I would probably run over the edge.
Nice.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
go ahead, Dr. Scott.
Yeah. Dr. Scott, that's a good one. A couple of quick questions. First of all, like I want to ask a little bit, like we had your partner in crime, Mr. Rob Heinz, who wanted
Oh
just
yeah.
recently, and I asked him a question that I want to ask you, but I don't
Yeah.
want to yet. So I guess that's a footnote. Epigram company. I'll preview the question, which is really interesting because you're talking around how like you find it really interesting to experiment with rules. And one of
Yeah.
the longest conversations that Ben and I have had on this podcast, and that I also have constantly with my own gaming groups, is where how important are the rules versus the people at the table, the social situation, the way that people are kind of like working together, like because my groups and Ben, as we've touched on this many times in this podcast, is like how important are the mechanics, where, especially in a tabletop role-playing game where they're constantly be constructed dynamically, they're constantly under negotiation, they can be changed, they can be moved, they can be modified, they're always based on the subjectivity of the people at the table. And it's interesting to me that so I guess my other question is really important too, but I guess I'm going to lead with this because I'm talking too much, and now you have to answer it because I'll never be able to say this again. What do you think? Why is it that you like to tinker with the rules so much? How much emphasis would you place on the mechanics of a rule system having an impact on a specific game rather than a lot of the more subjective elements?
Yeah, uh I think the rules really kind of set the parameters of what you're able to
Sure.
do with the game. And so I'm a big believer in customizing rules for a particular game experience. Like, early on, I guess when like I was in high school, game design meant sort of how do you break combat down into rounds and roll to hit in this game? And now I've done games where you don't break combat down into rounds necessarily, and you don't roll to hit really. And so I think when I started, you can hack systems to make them better or whatever, but a lot of it is if you're playing a type of game, a simulation kind of battle game, you're not going to get two different results out of it. It is really going to depend on the people and the storytelling or whatever. But if you compare the experience that people have with Everway compared to 13th Age or whatever, it's going to be very different because the rules support very different kinds of creativity.
Yeah. What do you find so compelling about tinkering with the rules? Is it constantly you're trying to, is there some, I was going to Ur experience that you're trying to get everyone to eventually reach, or is it that you want it's interesting because you talked about the eclectic nature of all the rule systems that you've designed. And I love that you answered, well, I would use different rule systems for different groups. Is that like what you're kind of reaching towards at some point? Like every time you create a new rule system, it's a new tool in your belt pouch that you can be like, all right, this is what we're going to do. Let's choose
Yeah,
those mechanics. And I guess my question is,
that's right.
why do you love making rule sets?
Yeah. Well, for me, making rule sets is almost more of my hobby than playing the games themselves. Once you start inventing games, then that's more interesting than inventing a campaign or, creating a monster, creating a whole game system. So it's fascinating. Um, but I would say the one thing that I think I have tried to do in all my games is to show people how they can be more creative, how they can have
Huh.
more narrative control, more narrative freedom, more characterization, more narrative interest. And so sometimes it's a game like Ars Magica or 13th Age, which is meant to be crunchy and where, the roles you make in combat really count. And, um, you know, you can use tactics and build your character over a long period of time and develop that character. And then in each one, in different ways, we sort of promoted uh, creativity and making the story your own and that sort of thing. And then you have games like Over the Edge and Everway that are more freeform, less about tactics and less about campaign play, and more about jumping right into an experience with a full-fledged character that plays really fast because you're not playing out every combat, every round by round. You're sort of um, treating battles kind of like other challenges that you can maybe resolve with one draw of the card or one cast of the dice. Um, so in some ways, it's like trying different ways to do the same thing. Like, here's a way to encourage people to be creative in this way, and here's a way to help people be creative in that way. So in 13th Age, we use the sort of the D&D setting that people know as the the foundation. Like you know enough already about dwarves and elves and whatever that now you can start riffing on it. Now you can start making
Yeah.
up stuff and adding to the world and saying, in this campaign, dwarves are a little different. They're like this, that, or the other. And so the shared setting, the shared experience of people sort of knowing that default fantasy setting gives people the basis for creating stuff. And in every way, it's completely different, where there's no assumed setting at all, but you have images, little cards with fantasy images on them, and then those ground your character. That's what you use to riff off of. So in both games, it's let's take something more or less concrete that lets people, move in a new dimension or take something in a new direction. But there's a world of difference between 13th Age with its, spell lists and critical hit rolls and whatever, and Everway with its fortune deck where everything is kind of resolved mystically or narratively. But creativity, getting people to be creative.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you kind of led with that concept of like I mean, so much of tabletop role playing games, I think in many ways is like, even I don't care how long you've played, in many ways is like teaching people how to take agency over a
Yeah,
game, which is
yeah,
so kind of unusual because
yeah,
games are basically around like you've got to be within these bounds, and your tabletop role playing games are all about complicating what those boundaries are.
right.
If Ben, if you don't mind my indulgence on this one, I would ask the second question, which
I'm
was,
I'm going to throw out two things really quick before your
yep,
second question.
sure.
I want to mention briefly, Matt Forbeck mentioned after his most recent Marvel role-playing game came out that it's amazing how much more difficult it is to create a tabletop role-playing game than, say, a novel. And yet usually the tabletop role-playing game doesn't pay nearly as well as the novel does. Um, And I also wanted to mention that the reason that you are here, before we get too deep into this, is that
Yeah,
there is a second edition of 13th Age kickstarting
that's right.
right now. And it is a D20 rolling fantasy tabletop role playing game designed by you and Rob Heinso. Rob Heinso. I
There
got
you
it right the
go.
second time.
You
Sorry,
got it.
Rob. Um,
He doesn't mind.
he was very generous about it. Um, and it's kickstarting right now. There is a
Yep.
link in the show notes. Go there if you have not yet backed it. Back it. Jonathan, could you give me just one thing that you would highlight from 13th Age for someone who maybe hasn't played it before? Get something to tease
Right.
them and get them to follow the link.
Right. So it is a D20 style game, so it has the dwarves and fighters and spells and the things that you're used to. It's just all hyped up and dialed up to 11 um and so one of the best examples of that, I think, is that in addition to picking your, what kin you are, you're a dwarf, you're an elf, whatever, what class you are, you're a barbarian, you're a bard, um, you also create something about your character that's unique, that's part of the narrative. It's not like you have laser eyes or, some mechanical or procedural thing, but a narrative element that locates your character in the greater story of the campaign. So one guy was, I'm the last living drow of my village, No, I'm the last living drow in the world. And so that becomes his
Yeah.
part of his character. And then, you could never do that in a video game because everything is set up that you can do whatever the designer pre-programmed you to be able to do. And if they didn't pre-program you to rewrite the game so that you're the only drow in the world, you just can't do it. And so what the one unique thing does is it takes what's unique, if you will, what's special about role-playing games that we're inventing them. It's our imaginations, and it just says, what's the most you can do with that you can't do, in some online game or a shooter or whatever. And that is the one unique thing. You also can't do it in your, Living Greyhawk campaign or whatever. If there's like a specific rule set where everyone's supposed to play in this league and they're all supposed to follow the rules and everything's supposed to be fair. Well, that's one way to play role-playing games, but that's not the most creative way. The most creative way is that what happens at your table could not happen at any other table. And the experience that you and your players have because of what you bring to the table is an experience that no other party out there is having. And again, creativity.
That is a great description. So again, link is in the show notes. Go check it out right now. When this episode drops, you'll probably have about 3 or 4 days left to back the Kickstarter. So do not waste time. Go there. Pause the episode. Go there now. Scott, go ahead. Go ahead. Go to your second question.
It's so difficult to go back to my second question where there's so many things that were brought up, this concept of creativity, and I'm just really stuck. I swore I'll ask my second question, but I'm so stuck on that idea of like how important it is to be, to make games that are specific to like the concept of like, we've all played in con games. It's funny because I at one time when I used to go to DungeonCon, I'm not trying to make being careful because I love DungeonCon, but I used to go back and I used to play what you were talking about, like the Living Greyhawk games. Used to do the Pathfinder Society games, and they were never fantastic because there was it's interesting because I'm a big fan of the concept that I think boundaries make games interesting. I think boundaries make any type of creativity interested. My favorite quotation, which I just quoted earlier today, is by Orson Welles, which is the absence of limitations is the enemy of art. At the same time, like what you just said, I just really speaks to me, that concept of like, how much can you do when you're trying to make, as you kind of put it, trying to make similar experiences. If you're trying to craft similar experiences, irregardless, that's not a word, is it? Regardless of who is sitting there, that doesn't necessarily work. Like it should always be, and you can't have, like, that's the thing about a con DM. You're like, no, you've got to give them all the exact same Swanson tabletop role-playing game, Hungry Man.
That's right. That's right.
So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, the first AD&D modules were tournaments.
Yeah.
Right? Where it's like, it has to be played a specific way, and it's about winning or losing. So that
you can get a score. So that you can get a score. So that you
can get a score.
Yeah. So I wasn't going to try to interrupt you, but you're exactly what you're thinking about is like that concept of like, you've got to have the same experience because we've got to be able to compare your score against somebody else's.
That's right.
And nothing was weirder than running the entire Slave Lords modules for my 1E group because and if we had run it at Origins back in the 70s, we wouldn't have gotten the insane narratives that we got based on me being like, have giggles and poops with this. Let's see where it goes.
Right.
But
that's right.
I will finally ask my second question. Why did you choose the passage you did from the Dr. Eric Holmes set?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm not sure. There's lots of stuff that I could have picked. And so since I picked it, I've been thinking that, like, why did I pick that? What is going on here? And first of all, I picked it because this was the first D&D product I ever got, was this book. And those paragraphs are maybe the most flavorful paragraphs in the whole book. Like the monster descriptions are kind of okay or whatever, but this is like, oh, there's a place and there's pre-human ruins and there's a history and there's spooky stuff. And so it sort of suggests to you, this is a game about mystery and strangeness and, inhuman ruins. And that is super appealing. Like the idea that goblins are up there dancing in the moonlight and it scares everybody, so they have to destroy the tower. Like what's up with that? But then you get into the actual description of the dungeon, and there's nothing, right? There's goblins. You find out that goblins wear leather armor and they fight with swords and daggers, and they
Huh.
have little rude tables that they hang out at, and they keep their stuff in sacks. And that, so if you thought goblins were like mysterious and they dance in the moonlight and they're part of some weird goblin culture, no, they're just kind of hanging out in this room, and they have no culture and they don't dance, but they've got one eight-sided die -1 hit points. And so the discrepancy between like, oh, this is a game of like, there's a there's a world here, there's a city, there's people coming from all over the world, there's this tavern, there's wow. Oh, okay, well, I guess it's a 40-foot by 60-foot room with some one hit die monsters in it. Okay. And while there was instructions for like how to stat out your dungeon, right? You can randomly roll monsters and treasures, and the box set came with, the monster and treasure assortments where you could just roll percentile dice and say encounter number 37 takes place in this room, and then there's encounter 37, it's 2 to 5 orcs or whatever. The instructions never were come up with a cool place, like a cool city and maybe some history. And so, like the first time I ran my own dungeon, I didn't know what I was doing. And I read the background of the Xenopus because it didn't tell you how to do that. It was the coolest thing in there. And it's apparently not what you do as the game master is create that stuff.
Isn't that
So,
the challenge of the game? Like, isn't that is that like one of the challenges of being? It's funny because we started talking a little bit like you talking about like how you simulate these things.
yeah,
How do you simulate an aesthetic? Right? I mean, it's
that's right.
interesting because you're like, oh, there's goblins up there, but how do we turn the mystery of them dancing in the moonlight into
Right.
something you can interact with? And of course, Dr. Holmes doesn't have an answer because, as you said, it's like he's like, well, he then reduces them to hit points
Yeah.
and to hit chart.
Yeah.
What's your philosophy on how you simulate an aesthetic?
Well, that's kind of what I've been doing ever since is sort of, with Ars Magica, that's Wizards in the Middle Ages. And it's very crunchy and sort of historically based, but it like when we deal with the fairies, we try to make them unusual. Like you have to figure out what they mean when they talk to you, and they're kind of scary, and like they're spooky in a way that the goblins in that Xenopus uh, introduction are spooky, and goblins in the Monster Manual are not at all spooky. And so, there are demons and in Ars Magica that want to corrupt you, but maybe they'll help you out because they're happy to give you some material benefit if it means that they can curry favor with you for maybe catching your soul later or whatever. And so there are sort of dangers that are narrative based. um kind of like the goblins in the Hobbit, right? Like the so many goblins came out of the secret doors that they captured all the dwarves, and the dwarves, like, it wasn't like there was a fight. It was like the goblins are the spooky, scary thing that came out of the caverns and captured the dwarves, and then you know Bilbo has to find the goblin stabber sword or whatever, and um, fight them off. And it's like in the stories, it's narrative. It's story oriented. Um, Over the Edge is also very sort of free form, and so that you would be involved in the either the weird aliens that you were involved with. It's sort of modern day weirdness. If it's the mad scientists or the clones or the androids or whatever, just the freaks, you have to understand their culture, and you interact with them as persons, and you might end up getting in a fight, or whatever, but they have a narrative value, and Everway is like traveling from world to world in kind of this new age fantasy um multiverse. And then and again, you know, the creatures hardly have stats. It's all about what do they mean in the story, and what decisions are you going to make about how you interact with this creature, or this school of wizards, or this secretive cult, or and so I've been doing that over and over. 13th Age, has the mechanical elements, but then it has all these narrative elements, like the icons that sort of are the major players on the world stage. The Emperor and the High Priestess and the High Druid and the Diabolus and and so they provide these sort of narrative hooks um, that let you. Uh, Imagine that there's more to these monsters, than their stats, and that the game master can more readily connect them somehow to some bigger story. So in some ways, a lot of my career has been trying to make the promise of that introduction true for people. Like, not only can I write a cool introduction that you throw away once you walk down the dungeon stairs, and then it's all different. I could write a cool description in our Smagaka adventure, a 13th Age adventure, and there really will be spooky things in it that you have to interact with other than as units.
You're
Like
applying the Chekhov's gun rule to the like if you see goblins dancing in the moonlight, darn it, there better be a reason for that moonlight.
That's right.
At some point, right?
That's right. But yeah,
the gap between the promise of D&D and the reality of D&D has always been a bit of a challenge for me.
That's right. That's right.
And like second edition, I very much experienced as a literary format.
Oh yeah,
because I got it when I was like 12 years old.
Yeah.
I basically had no friends.
Okay.
I bought a bunch of second edition stuff for like 2 or 3 years, read it all, and then when I finally found people to play it with, I was like, this is not really the game that I thought it was. There's a lot of going through chests and drawers.
Yes.
And it's just not for me. And so then I fell into White Wolf.
Interesting.
For like 5 or 6 years, and it was delightful.
That's right.
So when I got 13th Age first edition and I opened it up, and it was like, hey, there's icons, and you are intimately involved in the running of this kingdom, and the things you do are significant. It was really the thing that made me want to run 13th Age.
Well, thank you.
It felt much more again, as you put it, it felt more like it delivered on the promise of what D&D was supposed to be. I'm going to stop interrupting you now.
No, that's good. That's good. And World of Darkness, that was really influential. That a lot of that derived from Ars Magica. It had the same ideas that you're a supernatural being in the real world, part of a secret organization with its own politics, and so that was. I think a lot of people learned sort of how to play more narratively from the World of Darkness stuff.
I might venture a claim that the all of tabletop role playing games, from Dungeons and Dragons to any of the games that we're kind of talking about, 13th Age or Everway or Pathfinder, are always chasing the promise of actually shouldn't say literally, because that's loaded of the experience of dwelling within these worlds. And I think we can all talk about how, I think it's maybe, Jonathan, you probably could speak to this more than I, but the concept of like making rules or tinkering with the worlds is always more experiments, and like, how can we get closer to this perfect experience that we're all chasing? We've talked, Ben and I have on this podcast many times. I've talked about, because I love first edition, and I love a lot of the early rule sets, and my friends always kind of joke around, like, if your ambition was to create an experience for people where they actually feel like Robert E. Howard's Conan going through, the Hyborbian Age, this game has nothing to do with that in many ways. Like, it's literally like managing encumbrance to trying to figure out exactly what these things, and yet it's the promise of eventually at some point. And I would still say that even though I don't think that I haven't played 13 Age, but so maybe 13 Age gets it perfectly. But like, there's no role-playing game that I'm going to point to as well designed and as elegant as many of these rule systems are that perfectly captures
Yeah.
that. It's the pursuit of happiness. It's the pursuit of perfect verisimilitude that we're all reaching for. That is very much compelling us.
Yeah.
But I don't think we've ever. And certainly, I would say I don't think computer role-playing games do it either.
Yeah.
We're still chasing that perfect experience of like we're sitting down, being perfectly immersed in a wonderfully verisimilitudinous world, and getting that experience of being Conan. No game has yet, I think, gotten that, but the promise and that pursuit of verisimilitude is in many ways more compelling than I think the perfection that we'll probably never reach, if I may venture a claim.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a fair claim. It sounds like you're saying that lots of people read stuff like Conan or whatever, and it's really cool. And then here is a game that has the same features. It's got sorcerers and barbarians and swords and giant snakes. And so now I can have that experience. But it's like, well, actually, you're going to be with a group of other low-level people walking down a dungeon, like tapping the floor for traps. So it's not the same. And I think that is right, that the Dungeons and Dragons came out of wargaming,
Yep.
right? Rather than out of, say, improv or whatever, or even like ska impersonations or, Society for Creative Anachronisms and
Sure.
that sort of thing. So, in war, most people are foot soldiers. Most people are
Right.
you know, replaceable and expendable. And that's your first level D&D character in your original experience, where you and a bunch of other schlubs go into some dangerous place and maybe one of you gets killed. And maybe you all do. Who knows? So,
But that's the same thing as it's like the promise. It's like I almost feel like it's like a holy grail that we're all searching for. It's like it's funny to me because I think one of the things that does compel us as D&D players to start that first edition or any character in any fantasy role playing game is the concept not that we are Conan, but if we play our cards correctly, maybe one day we will be.
That's right. That's right. It's my fault that I'm not Conan, and it's my fault that I'm not Rich. One day,
darn it,
and any of those things could happen. So I think that James Bond 007 probably is a pretty good take on what you can do if you are trying to capture an experience. So I know people who played it, and from the stuff they tell me about is like, oh, that sounds like sort of a goofy Roger Moore, you know, a James Bond movie. It actually kind of does.
And
one of the things they did.
Sorry, this is the TSR game from the 80s?
This is Victory Games.
Victory Games.
Yeah, from the 80s. I call it the first story-oriented role-playing game.
Really?
I've never. So it's funny because Ben, as soon as you said that, I was also thinking of Top Secret, which was the TSR game, right?
That's right.
So James Bond. So I'm literally turning to the
James Bond 007.
Okay, and Victory Games.
Victory Games.
Do you recall who designed it?
I do, but I'm spacing on his name. How embarrassing.
Dr. Scott will find it on the internets, but
Gerard Christopher King.
All right, so you were saying that was the first narrative story game. Tell us all about that.
Well, for one thing, it's mostly for one game master and one player. So it's like, well, let's take seriously, if you want to be James Bond, he doesn't really have a sidekick. You then have an experience where one person is playing the super spy and then the other person is sort of setting up one challenge or another after them, and they're trying to like solve the mystery and do the thing. But because it's one-on-one, it really can sort of feel like you're James Bond, right? And it has a pretty fast resolution system where like one die roll, depending on how good it is, can get a variety of results rather than making a couple of different rolls. So that's good. And it has some sort of like a hero point system or something to affect the narrative outcome, so the player has some influence. I don't remember what that is exactly, but it's but that's what you need to do if you want to have that experience. It can't be about 6 people all with player characters all wanting to have a sixth of the spotlight, because that's not James Bond or Conan or Tarzan or anything. It's not Dritz Durden. So I think it's really hard to make that and maybe I'll say it's kind of impossible to make that work, to go to replicate or to emulate or evoke the single protagonist experience in a multiplayer game. Maybe Ghostbusters kind of does it. In Ghostbusters, you do have like a small team of guys that have different abilities and they work together to kill the thing. And so maybe that works, but it's very different from
And you're
leveling
talking
up.
about the West End Games
West
Ghostbuster
End
game?
Games Ghostbusters game, yeah, that Chaosium designed. Yeah, Sandy Peterson and others.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting.
So
Is like many of the Appendix N, most
yeah,
of the texts you talk about in Appendix N are never based on parties. And
that's right.
Conan. Well, we keep coming back to Howard Conan, which I
Yeah,
suppose we think of as like the Ur archetype of the giant warrior, and one of the experiences that we're trying to replicate. But if we get outside with Fafhrd and then Grey Mouser, there's still only 2 of them.
that's right.
A lot of these folks, or you could take 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, you could take any of these things. Generally, we have a lone character,
That's
and
right.
when they often have companions, those companions
Yep,
generally don't last long.
that's
They're
right.
more of narrative,
That's right.
conveniences rather than they
That's
necessarily
right.
are any type of player with agency.
Yep,
It's always funny that the Appendix N texts are the ones that we're talking about trying to simulate,
yep,
when in general we talked about 2 things that complicate the focus of the Appendix N experience. If D&D was meant to make us feel like Conan, not only does it make us start as foot soldiers, as you put it, as like
yeah,
basically peasants of the road, but it also makes us share the spotlight with 5,
yeah,
or in when
yeah.
they were running first edition, 18 other people in the same
Right,
darn room, and
right.
they've all got to have a chance to shine. There's that weird
Yeah.
breakdown of like what experiences we're ever trying to get. And I think the chase is so important, which is that concept of like, well, how do we get closer to that chase? I don't have an
See,
answer, but
I don't know that I want to get any closer to that
yeah,
chase. Like,
sure.
because so one of the big shifts with third edition was, by the time we did third edition, D&D was so well established that it was its own reality. Like,
Yeah.
earlier versions
Yes.
of D&D were like, well, read these books to find out what it's like, or it's sort of like Tolkien. And second
Hmm.
edition would be like, oh, if you think of a wizard, maybe it's like Merlin. And I'm like, well, now we don't. Everyone knows what a wizard is. You don't need
Yeah.
to. So third edition, we just had it refer to itself, right? And so you had the Greyhawk deities and whatever. There's no discussion of like, this weapon was used in Switzerland in the 1500s to good effect, like, all gone. And I don't think we tried to, like, how could we make this like Conan? How could we make this like Lord of the Rings? It was like, how can we make this the best D&D experience yet? And we'd like, what's good about D&D? What happens when you play D&D? What should happen more when you play in D&D? What should happen less? And we just ramped up the D&D value of the game. And 13th Age is kind of the same, only more so,
Sure.
because it's like taking it to the next level where you're not just creating a character, you're affecting the narrative of the whole campaign. By creating your character's background, you are partially creating the whole campaign background.
You running
So
anything
again,
right
it's not
now? Sorry.
yeah.
Go ahead and finish your idea.
Oh, so it's like, maybe give up that trying to make that experience happen. Like, that's just not, like, the role-playing games now have their own reality and their own promise. And the promise is you can have a really great experience with a bunch of friends as a party over time. It's just different.
You
And
run
I think we
anything
can
right
hit
now?
that.
Sorry.
Am I
I'm gonna stop
running
interrupting you.
anything?
Yeah, you running
I,
anything? You playing anything?
so we're playtesting 13th Age. So I ran a couple of campaigns, and then right now Rob is running a campaign, and one of our players is running a campaign. So we get to both watch, what it's like when someone else is running our rules. That's pretty interesting. I'm notorious as the guy who hates fun and wants to nerf everything.
That's Interesting. I think we should. I'm sorry. I'm so struck by something that you said, and one of the questions. Well, actually, I'm gonna footnote this question. Uh, Jonathan, I imagine that you probably spend a lot of time as a DM. You're obviously a
Yeah,
designer, and everyone,
yeah,
everyone I think in this virtual room, we're almost always the forever DMs. But when I was doing my dissertation, every time I interviewed somebody around tabletop role playing games, my favorite question was always like, when you do play, what is the character class that you play? And why? But before I have got to say, I don't want us to bury the lead because I don't think there's anything. One of the most fascinating things that you said, and I think that our audience would find this fascinating, is that third edition Dungeons and Dragons was the first edition that was no longer using the concept of simulating, appendix N texts
yeah.
or these other
That's
things,
right.
but literally trying to simulate what the D&D experience was.
Yeah,
I think that is unbelievably fascinating. It makes me
yeah,
literally want to grab my third edition books here and read them again, thinking it under
yeah,
that frame, because I think that's so fascinating. Because now I'm a big fan of, like, I don't like quantification like this moment, but my
yeah,
gosh, you've literally said that was the moment as far as
yeah,
edition goes, and you
yeah,
you kept saying, like, when you were talking out loud around, like, well, we're no longer going to talk about weapons in Switzerland. As soon as you say that, I think about Zeb Cook and
yeah,
second edition, because they all those editions are so ripe, and like, now you're playing Robin Hood. They're
yeah,
constantly referring
yeah,
to, whether it's not history
yeah.
or text that people would
Legends.
know.
Yep, that's right.
But it's so fascinating to me that third edition is the
Yeah,
moment where you're like, we are not going to refer to Robin Hood. We're
that's
going
right.
to refer to Dungeons and Dragons,
That's
because
right.
now we've now been around so much. We've
Yeah,
become so culturally ubiquitous that you know what we talk about when we say
yeah,
lawful good
yeah,
or what a polearm is. So
yeah,
I thought that was fascinating.
yeah,
I don't know if I have a question for you on that, but I'm thanking you. Like, that is
yeah,
so interesting to me. And I
yeah. You're
imagine,
welcome. Yeah, it was
yeah.
great to be there. I think for second edition, I think Lorraine, the one who owned D&D, I don't think she really liked D&D. I don't think she really liked role-playing games.
Huh.
Like, she, under her watch, they released the Buck Rogers role-playing game,
Yeah.
which was D20 before there was a D20 license, and they never told people. They never said, hey, this is basically a D&D supplement for science fiction. So you can now buy this game and they've got room for lasers and spaceships and whatever. But, I think as the heiress to the Buck Rogers fortune, she didn't want it to get muddied up with this dirty, weird fantasy role-playing game that these nerds liked. And so it wasn't like years later, I got a hold of the game and was like, holy moly, why did no one ever know this? Right. Whereas when the nerds were running things in the back of AD&D, there was like, you can play Gamma World, you can play Boot Hill, right in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide. So anyway, I think that's my explanation for why second edition was so generic.
I'm gonna tell a Joe Manganiello story.
Yeah.
So Joe Manganiello is one of two people to have interviewed Lorraine Williams since her departure from TSR.
All
The
right.
the other person was David M. Ewalt of Forbes magazine for his book of Dyson Men.
Oh, okay.
So, and this is the story as Joe Manganiello told it to me.
Yeah.
He flies to Chicago. He films her in her house in front of a apparently very large portrait of George Washington, and he eases into the question by saying, "Hey, my wife Sofia Vergara, she's not into D&D, but you know what? One time we rolled up a character and I made her play. She played D&D one time, so she understands what I'm doing in the basement with my friends." And he says to Lorraine Williams, "So you owned the company. You must have sat down one time and played it, right?" She's like, "No, never." He's like, "Never, never."
Yeah.
So
There you go.
And the whole ethos of when TSR was founded was that it would always, I don't know if that was imprinted for forever in their motto, but I know so many times have said that, like, this will always be an organization, to rip off Interplay for gamers and by gamers. And was Brian Bloomer the first non-gamer, or was it Kevin Bloom? That was
Let's
the
say
first
Kevin
non-game.
Bloom.
It's like once you walk down that dark path
Yeah.
of non-gamers, forever will dominate your destiny, right?
Yes, Wizards of the Coast, it's true.
But anyway, I skipped over the question. What do you, Mr. Tweet? What do you play when you finally get a chance to play Dungeons and Dragons? What class do you play and why?
Well, you might not be surprised if I tell you that I play different classes. I don't have um, a particular favorite. The one thing that all of my characters have to have is at least one level of irony. There's got to be there's got to be something going on beneath the surface, or um, some way that what they say is not true, or
Huh.
uh, some way that their presentation is not uh, is not synced up. Like I had a kobold war mage who um, you know, was smarter than everyone else in the group, and then sort of put on like she was better than she actually was. And or have a sage who thinks that the whole world is an illusion, and then what does that mean as an adventurer? Um, I had a dwarf fighter who had rejected the stultifying conformity of dwarven culture, and she was now out being a crazy adventurer, and she told everyone she was chaotic because compared to the dwarves she lived with, she was chaotic, but she was neutral good. So she would say something like, I'm gonna look, there's our buddy over there. I'm gonna shoot him in the back with my crossbow because I'm crazy. And then she wouldn't do it. It's like, oh no, I guess I won't. But so her own sense of who she was different from my sense of who she was. And then to add to the irony, she was very proud to call herself a Thrunza. And a Thrunza is a label that the dwarves give to dissidents who don't like the labeling system. So it's the label for people who reject labels. And she loved being a Thrunza and never realized that she was betraying her Thrunza principles by accepting the label Thrunza. And so you got to have there's got to be something for me to play with. There's got to be some where the players aren't sure what I'm going to do because my own character is somehow at cross purposes.
I would like to return to the gap between the promise of D&D and the reality of D&D.
Sure.
So again, in the 90s, which is my golden age of role-playing games, playing a lot of White Wolf, and I'm playing in games and I'm playing with people where we're playing characters, we're doing
Yep.
funny voices,
Yep.
we're exploring a story space, and we have goals.
Yep.
And again, we go from that to D&D, and we're like, this is a very different, much more war gamey style of play.
Yeah. Yeah.
In the decades since then, it has seemed like that style of play has come to be the dominant style of play in D&D. When I again get together, I
Yeah.
constantly talk about the women under 30 from my
Yeah.
school, but here we
Yeah.
go again. When I play with the women under 30 at my school and we play D&D, they're doing funny voices, they're having goals.
Yep.
They are there
Yep.
to live out their character's story, not
Yeah.
make it to 10th level and get a wish ring.
Yeah.
So I'm going to
Yep.
end this personal anecdote with a question for you, which is when you look at the practice of uh, the tabletop role playing game as it is done at people's tables, is it different than it was in the 80s, and is it better?
I think it's different and I think it's better. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, the early role-playing games seem to be by and for people on the autism spectrum, and they're very focused on like charts and numbers and percentages, and if it takes us twice as long to do something, but it's 10% more accurate, that's worth it. It's the the world is a model terrain set where a lot of the work is just building it, not even actually playing with it or whatever. And so the effort of like rolling extra dice to take into account the extra conditions, or is part of the fun. for some style of play. And I've moved way away from that, where in Everway or Over the Edge, you can resolve things with a single random divination, right? Do you draw a card in Everway and interpret what it means to resolve the conflict, or a player casts their lots in, a pair of dice and in Over the Edge, and that determines success or failure, and you live with that. If it's a failure, it's a failure. It's not you failed this round and you have to keep rolling until you succeed. It's like, okay, there's a bad consequence to the thing you tried to do. So it's very fast and more, it's not how much damage do we take getting through this room. It is like, how do we deal with this situation? And does it lead us to this narrative juncture or to that narrative juncture? It's very different. And I think it's better. I think it's more interesting. I think it's more, like you can talk about it more. Like you can talk about your character having a history and having goals and pursuing those goals, right? Like, boy, in the 80s, if you're doing a hex crawl or a dungeon crawl or whatever, you can't then tell your friends who weren't there the cool stuff that happened, because mostly it's just all variants. It's like you open the door and this kind of monster is there and you fight it that kind of way and you get this other kind of treasure, and then you repeat that, and it doesn't have that story element. So I think it's better, and I'm really happy to see that that style of play has spread. Now, Gary Gygax was a little disappointed, and he made a really interesting point kind of after third edition was released, which was people don't flee anymore. Fleeing is, in his mind, a big part of succeeding in a dungeon is running away from the toughest half of the fights.
Right.
And knowing, like, we can't take this, we got to run. And that's a really different kind of game. That's a game that's kind of a libertarian game, where it's like you're on your own, player characters, and if you think you want to fight these monsters when you shouldn't, they'll kill you, and that's what you get for making the wrong decision. And games today seem much more curated, where it's like the game master is setting up things for you to dive in and enjoy them, right? Like the idea of you come to a monster and the players are like, well, should we have the fun of getting in a combat with this monster, or should we, instead of having that fun, run away and not interact with it? Well, in old style of play, running away was smart, and that you had to do that if you wanted your character to survive. And the new way, it's like, why would you set up an encounter where you don't get to dive in and have fun, taking it on head first? So very different style, right? Very different.
It is a very different style. I can't remember whether it was, we recently went over this whole concept of like combat as war versus combat as sport, which is the concept is should every encounter be perfectly formulated so that it's like two teams evenly matched. It's funny because I'm currently running 5e Strahd, and I'm a bit of an OSR guy, so it's interesting to me because I can hear kind of the philosophies that you're talking about. But as a general rule, my main philosophy in the games that I run is always about verisimilitude, which is that if you run into an encounter where this thing is living, well, of course, the thing that you're talking about when we talk about old school games is there was no dungeon ecology at all. So that made any type of verisimilitude in a sense. You could literally have a gelatinous cube next to goblins who existed in one little room, and nobody explained, not only where they got food, but also where they went to the restroom. But to me, I like this concept of a world where you can step into it and think that these things are existing. And again, this is just different philosophical, and it comes back to some of the core concepts we were talking again, is like, who or what does the world revolve around?
Yeah.
And that always is going to be based on what the players want at the table. And that as DMs or as game designers, I think that's the concept you're always thinking about. It's like, what type of experiences? Because I think in the end, whether you're simulating hit points or you're creating a narrative aesthetic, you're always constantly, the number one priority that you have is, what is the type of experience I'm trying to create for a group of people?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me. That's the thing, of course, it's funny. It's like, but also you have to include yourself among those things. One of the
Well,
reasons why
that's
I'm
right.
such an OSR guy is that I cannot, I am not a fair DM. I'm writing, I was about to say my Strahd thing, which is like, no, if you are going to stumble into where, Baba Yaga is in this thing, you are going to be ground up like meat. Now, as a DM, my responsibility is to give you some premonitions that maybe this isn't the right place to go. But
Yeah.
I'm such a big adherent of the concept of like, no, I'm not going to make encounters fair because I want you to feel like you're in a world that makes you feel slightly unsettled. The only reason I do that, one, is because I'm interested, and generally I run for players that are interested in that. If I
Yeah.
ran for different groups, or if I run for, like I'm about to run a bunch of AD&D games at Gamehole, of course, I'm not going to be able to run that same type of game. I just
Yeah.
think it's fascinating to think that it's always entangled with the type of experience you're trying to run based on the type of people that are interested in
Yeah.
the game that you're running, but also yourself as well, right?
Yeah.
You okay to talk for about 10 more minutes, Jonathan?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Then let me ask you this. Are there any games or books that you would recommend to people?
Games or books that I would recommend to people. Let me think on that. You got another question?
I can come up with another question. Um, what would I like it to be? Wow.
Okay. Okay. Um,
What's the single greatest piece of art in the third edition rule books?
That's a good one.
oh, that's an interesting one. Greatest piece of art.
I shouldn't say single best. I
I
should say
like
your
no,
favorite.
I like the red dragon with the dwarf
Mhm.
Tordek in his mouth
Yeah.
near the grappling rules. I think that is really good.
Oh, and I
Um,
did have another question if you
yeah,
can't answer my prior one, which was,
yeah.
did Gary Gygax tell you any of his other thoughts on third edition?
That's a great question, Ben.
Uh, not much. He really liked Monty Cook's advice to game masters in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Um, and he didn't like the way I portrayed alignments. But I think he must not have read the whole paragraph because you get the wrong idea if you read just the first paragraph.
Hmm.
That was the one where for the six alignments, lawful, good, neutral, good, the three good alignments and the three neutral alignments, each line starts lawful good is the best alignment because neutral good is the best alignment because chaotic good is the best alignment because so that no matter what alignment you picked, you could understand why that could be the coolest for somebody. And if you only read the first paragraph, it sounds like I'm picking one alignment to be the better than all the others.
Well, it's such a
Uh,
clever way to write it too.
yeah, thank
You're right. It
you.
pulls you in. It explains how to be the character, not just what this is. Um,
Yes. Yeah. So for lawful neutral in second edition, it said something like lawful neutral might be a soldier who follows orders because he has to. I'm like, what? You're not selling me on it like that. You want no one to be lawful neutral? Like, why would you, and to me, that was sort of like I'm trying to explain what lawful neutral means in some objective sense. And for me, it's like, don't do that. Explain what lawful neutral means in the sense of why someone would want to play that and what that adds to the game. Don't be objective. Anyway, but not much. He was going to write some artifacts for us and then didn't meet the deadline. Um, so he was happy that the game was saved. That's for sure.
Was there any particular really difficult decision you had to make in the rules creation for third edition? Like something that you were just like hemming and hawing about back and forth that really you had to make a decision on something and there were really, really strong arguments on both sides.
Uh, Boy, I don't think there was any there was any kind of outlier on that. There was one guy who really insisted that melee rounds had to be 12 seconds and not 6 because 6 was not realistic or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, um, we had real trouble figuring out what to do for initiative. And partly that's because the system that we ended up using, we almost didn't try because it was so different from second edition. And so it was like, you know, we the second edition system had issues that it slowed down play, but the version that I was pushing was fast, but it was really different and just seemed like we didn't know if people would accept it. And so we almost just never tried it, and then we never would have put it in the system. And as it is, we tried it and mostly liked it. And then when we reviewed playtesters on it, that was one of the rules with a U-shaped survey result where lots of people really liked it, but a fair number of people really hated it. There were not many people who were neutral on switching to keeping the same initiative score round after round.
And yet now I just think of that as the way it is.
I know. There's no rule that I miss more than
than weapon speed.
No, well, I do love weapon speed, although that's a strange rule.
Do you?
But I do. Oh, my second. Oh, it's one of my favorite things. Well, because it adds that element of thinking around like what like any way that you can add a little bit of personality to weapons or the choices that you make is fun. It is a simulationist element, but that wasn't the thing that I was going to bring up. Is because I run 1E, there is nothing swingier, and I mean this in a bad game design sense, in that. It is so easy to TPK a party in first edition because you didn't roll initiative, and because you're rolling initiative, and because and by the way, the 1E that we roll is based on Osric. It's not based because it's almost impossible to figure out what the actual rules were.
Fair enough.
Offense, Mr. Gygax and Arneson. Is that it's so unbelievably swingy in that it is so easy to miss if you don't roll initiative first, and that means that the entire type of monster gets to go first. They can easily wipe out your party. Now the same is true for the party as well.
That's right.
Because you get to decide who's going to go first and who's going to go first. But you got 6 of you or 8 of you, or again, if it's 1977, 19 of you that go first.
Yeah, it's crazy. Super swingy.
It's way bigger than it takes I'm trying to roll an 18. Well, who cares? You got 7 other people that can now roll 18, right? Which I think is interesting. But I loved that radical contingency of every round. When I run Stratum, it's funny because my group always jokes because I'm constantly we'll roll for initiative again. They're like, dude, it's 5th edition. By now you should have realized that we just keep that same initiative. I'm like, really? That's no fun. Anyway.
So. Any recommendations come to mind, or
no? I think of my games, 13th Age is the most accessible. If somebody wants to get some ideas for how they could play their own game system differently, like play D&D differently or play whatever kind of system they're playing, it's the most accessible in that the rules are straightforward. It's really easy for you to understand what's going on. And the support for the story elements is really strong. And a lot of that stuff you could port into other game systems pretty straight. And so it combines the advantages of being similar to other games so you can really understand what's going on and having really new ideas in it, like how the background skills work and your one unique thing and your icon relationships. And so that it seems like a really great bridge from what people know to a new stuff. My Over the Edge is the game I still get royalties on, so you can definitely pick up Over the Edge to see sort of my latest thinking on story-oriented play. For a game that's not mine, I like Apocalypse World. I think I like it more than anything that's powered by the Apocalypse.
Wow.
And I played Apocalypse World, and it taught me something about good game design, and I haven't run it successfully with my group, but it's still on my list to try that sometime because I would like to sort of get more out of what's cool in that in that game. For world builders, if you like building your game world, I would recommend either the book Debt by Graeber. Um, Forget his first name. Anyway, so he's a left-wing anthropologist writing about money and debt all around the world for all of history. And it's really eye-opening in terms of just how do economies work when D&D has sort of like it is kind of a Wild West economy, and it's not at all realistic to anything like the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages or anything. And this book Debt really just shows like this is what money and finance and merchant stuff were like in the Arab world, in ancient China, in medieval Europe, in these uh, tribes in Africa, and just very eye-opening to help you create a world that's more um, not just more realistic, but sort of has this interesting depth and takes you out of being sort of the way that we expect economies to run and money to work. And then the other one is Francis Fukuyama's book, Origins of Political Order. And that's the same thing in that it's this world history of, all these different cultures throughout history, but it's about how you get political order and how you prevent powerful elites from using cronyism and nepotism to corrupt the economy and the country. How do how do you get people to cooperate on a big scale instead of collapsing into factions that bring everything down? And like Debt, it sort of serves as a history of the world where you get to like, wow, here's all these really big changes over time in how people were governed and what power did the king have, and I think especially in America where we don't have much history in our own country of what kings were like and the nobility and whatever, it's kind of eye-opening to hear about kings being the champions of the poor people, and we always think of the kings are the bad people who tried to tell other people what to do because we're Democrats. We're Americans and we're against uh, monarchy, and it's like, oh no, the peasants liked the monarchs because the monarchs were on the peasants' side. Like, who knew that? And so there's all this just becomes really interesting, makes it more interesting to think about like how did these societies develop and how is power shared and how do the institutions work. So either one of those I highly recommend. The Francis Fukuyama is more sort of down to earth and nuts and bolts and sort of realpolitik and maybe conservative in that way, and then Graeber, he's a left-wing guy, so it's like the most left-wing take you can have on economics. So I recommend it to all my left-wing friends because they won't listen. I mean, it's like, here's something on economics that you'll listen to because it's coming from a guy on your side.
Wow.
I'm
That's
I'm
absolutely
I'm on the
fascinating.
left, but I like both of those guys, I think. Obviously, this is why I'm promoting them.
Well, in closing, I'm going to say, hey, um, if you have not yet done so, if you didn't pause 50 minutes ago and going back the 13th Age Kickstarter, going back it right now. Jonathan, I could ask you questions for another hour. I'd love to know about the process of getting 13th Age published by Pelgrane, but we're out of time, and I'm
All
sure you need to
right.
go eat dinner or have
That's
a
right.
stiff drink.
That's
Um,
right.
so
Well,
I'm gonna
weed's legal here in Washington, so
you enjoy, sir. Um, I'm going to shout out, hey, if you like us, you can support us on Patreon and get access to our Discord. If you're listening to this and you haven't bought my book yet, why not? Go buy my book. Um, it's a history of the Silver Age of Dungeons and Dragons at TSR. Scott is available for discussions on Discord, and if you ask him nicely, he'll show you his dissertation.
Yeah,
ooh.
you have to ask really, really, really nicely. Um, Yeah, no, I show it to everyone. But again, it puts children to sleep if you need a sleeping aid. It's there for you. What a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Mr. Tweed, for joining us. That was, I mean, there's so many, as Ben just said a second ago, there's so many different threads that I think we could follow. But it's so interesting to hear some of the philosophies behind you. I loved listening to kind of some of the books that you had. So I just wanted to say how much I appreciated your time, and I do hope that everyone out there is supporting 13H Kickstarter. But again, every time I look up the Kickstarter, it always tells me how much I have to give in pounds. Is there a reason why is it in British currency?
The
Pelgrane is in
publishers in
England.
it, yeah.
Oh, that's it. Okay, sorry. I was always because I'm like, they're on the Northwest. Why is this in pounds? But
That's also why if you see it in dollars, the goal was, had 5 digits in it, like $62,529. I'm like, why was it that? Oh, because it's in pounds. So the other exciting thing about the 13th Age Kickstarter is that after you sign up, you get access to the preview document, so you can see for yourself the version of second edition that we have almost completed. And you can see the rules for the unique things and the backgrounds and the icons and the icon connections. And we've really ramped up the story element. Like we knew when we launched, was it 12 years ago or 11 years ago, that we had opened up a whole bunch of possibilities on how to do more stories, and bring more story elements to the game, but we didn't have experience of how that all worked. And now we've got 10 years of experience, and now we can come back and say what was promising 10 years ago, now we can really deliver on that promise. And so you get to see that preview just for signing up.
That's amazing. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. You have a good night. Scott, see you soon. Everybody be safe and be well.
All right. Take care. This was great.
Bye-bye.